Welcome to the Liberal Antidote. In today's video, we're going to take a look at an interview between Auron Macintyre and political historian Paul Gottfried. This interview took place after Macintyre interviewed Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin and British philosopher Nick Land, in which they debated the nature of liberalism. In this interview, Professor Gottfried attempts to separate classical liberalism from its more progressive contemporary manifestations. Let's take a look.
So you contacted me after watching the Alexander Dugin and Nick Land debate, and you had some interesting thoughts about the nature of liberalism, the kind of the historical development. And so maybe we could just start at the beginning, because a lot of people were looking at the Nick Land debate, and the one thing both of them seem to kind of settle on is that globalist liberalism is kind of this mutation of a liberalism that arises from a Western and particularly an Anglo way of understanding the world. What is your reaction to that kind of general framework?
Well, I think there is a small truth in that statement, but it's also covered over with all kinds of qualifications that I think should be made. That although liberalism very definitely has among other points of origin, an English point of origin, and one might say that liberalism reaches its political apogee in England in the 19th century. Its ideas go back to a much earlier time, and I think are much more widespread than your two guests last week suggested. I would also indicate that I sometimes become annoyed when I hear the word liberal simply used by people on a certain kind of right, or counter-revolutionary right, or neo-reactionary right, making liberalism synonymous with everything they dislike. That liberalism, what they call liberalism, covers a lot of different political movements. And although people today call themselves liberal, they use the term as a nice term for many people, just as the term conservative is nice for other people. What they're describing has very little to do with liberalism as it existed and was practiced in the 18th or 19th century. For instance, liberals of the early 19th century definitely accepted gender roles, had no interest in having women vote, believed in a restricted franchise with only those whom the French called censitaires, who paid a certain amount of taxes, owned property, should be allowed to vote. They believed in open debate, but only on certain subjects. And when this would also apply to the founding fathers of the United States, who believed in free speech, I think, as Walter Burns proved in a book many years ago, as it pertains to theological questions and political positions. They certainly did not believe that people had a right to sell pornography, or to attack traditional Judeo-Christian gender relations or how people live together. So that the liberalism only covered a very, very small list of what we would call rights, and it did nothing to get rid of hierarchy, social hierarchy, which it thought was actually good. As long as careers were open to talent, and even that, I suppose, depended, on whether you were a man or a woman, whether you were a citizen of a country, whether you were a tax-paying citizen, and so forth. So that, in effect, liberalism meant something much more conservative, if I may use that term, than anyone today would be suggesting by using the term liberal, or even the term conservative. Because 19th century liberals, whom I, describe as people who carried out the ideas of the bourgeoisie, the property educated classes at the time, were much more conservative than people are today. And the right against which they were reacting were things like feudal aristocracy, manorialism, in the case of France, the restriction of government positions to members of the aristocracy, which could not be given to the roturiers, the common lot, which was not only just the peasants, but it included also the professional classes. So I think we have to be very careful in how we use the word liberal.
Gottfried gives us a detailed account of classical liberalism's historical expression, and later in the video he explains that external causes moulded liberalism into something else entirely. When Gottfried describes limited rights and restricted voting to certain demographics, he's being historically accurate, but he's making the assumption that ideologies are static rather than evolving. What Gottfried has missed is that liberalism progressively reforms itself according to its own internal logic. Contradictions to liberty, including those upheld by classical liberalism, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Consider the history of the suffragette movement. It was common for suffragettes to advocate for voting rights for wealthy women whilst excluding poor women. The British suffragette Christabel Pankhurst was recorded as saying, quote, "Working women are the weakest portion of the sex. We want picked women, the strongest and most intelligent." Despite Pankhurst and other suffragettes' discriminatory attitudes, suffrage inevitably became universal in accordance with liberalism's internal logic. This mechanism, where the normativity of liberation progressively unfolds, operates independently of actors' intentions or theoretical inconsistency. It doesn't matter that a given classical liberal holds sexist opinions, or that many suffragettes held classist preferences. By claiming that classical liberalism's evolution is the result of external factors, Gottfried is essentially making a discontinuity argument, that the caterpillar is not the butterfly. On the other hand, in referring to liberalism's evolution as driven by its own normativity, I'm making the metamorphosis argument. The caterpillar is the butterfly in potential.
Or the arguments that I always hear against the Protestant Reformation, that, you go from Martin Luther to wokeness, in one move or something. This is ridiculous, these arguments. I mean, there's all kinds of intervening circumstances, over a period of 500 years by which you go from point A to point Z. So I've never liked these facile generalizations about, where a particular idea is going to take you, and trying to father upon, somebody who comes up with an idea you dislike 500 years ago, as the one responsible for the latest form of the left.
Yeah, there is a sense in which if you travel back far enough, for instance, the idea that the Protestant Reformation is responsible for all of wokeness, this is something that is often pointed to, and it's like, well, if you go back far enough, that means that the Catholic Church is responsible for all of wokeness. It's all about where you draw those lines.
They would argue because it was a rebellion against authority. Well, I couldn't imagine more authoritarian societies than 16th century Lutheran societies, or the Swedish Lutheran state, or the Danish Lutheran state. There obviously are other factors that are much more decisive than the fact that Luther rebelled against Rome.
In this case, I actually agree with Gottfried. The genealogical argument is ridiculous. Genealogical arguments attribute causality to qualities found in past philosophies to present ideologies. The most extreme example appears in Karl Popper's 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which traces 20th century totalitarianism directly to Plato's 4th century BC Republic. Popper writes that, quote, "What we call nowadays totalitarianism belongs to a tradition which is just as old or just as young as our civilization itself," unquote. This positions Plato as the originator of an intellectual tradition culminating in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. According to Popper, Plato's ideal state contained rigid hierarchy, censorship, collectivism, eugenic breeding programs, and central planning, all the hallmarks of modern totalitarianism. Popper argued that Plato thereby laid the groundwork for modern totalitarian systems, implying that such regimes take the form they do because of philosophical seeds planted millennia ago. A fundamental issue with this argument becomes apparent when we observe regimes that employ these policies without any plausible connection to Plato, such as Imperial Japan. Popper was famous for popularizing falsifiability in science, yet his genealogical theory is itself unfalsifiable. 20th century totalitarian regimes happened to contain some of Plato's ideas, but were void of others. How many of Plato's policy recommendations need to be absent from a regime for us to falsify a connection? Furthermore, how do we distinguish between the causal or coincidental inclusion of Platonic ideas? It seems that Popper, a philosopher of science, expects us to trust the genealogy on faith. There is, however, one grain of truth to the genealogical argument, and that is the idea of the ideological trajectory. At the core of any given ideology or religion lies a normative premise, a terminal value. In monotheism, this is obviously God, and, by extension, his commands. In ethnocentrism, it is the in-group's survival and success. In liberalism, the terminal value is liberation. This is called the thematic argument, because different systems with similar motivations achieve a type of convergent evolution due to their shared trajectory. This is the mechanism behind the metamorphosis argument I described earlier. Liberalism evolves in a particular direction because the theme of liberation plays a deterministic role. This means that liberationist systems, even if they emerged independently, would still share a resemblance.
Well, then let's get into some of those factors, because I think, as you say, the narrative that we usually hear when we're laying out this idea is that liberalism, and I do think there's some truth to this, that at some level, the willingness to open up, put everything under the rational microscope, make everything something that is at some level a rational or even sometimes voluntary association, this necessarily creates a level of liquidity in the things are moving around. There's not enough structure, there's not enough rigidity, there's not enough hierarchy. And once you kind of open the door to this, once all these things are kind of opened up to a public dialectic, this kind of thing, an integrative debate, they're going to kind of just naturally shift to the left, because the right tends to be kind of ordered. It tends to be about hierarchy. It tends to be about these fundamental axioms, as where the left tends to be about renegotiating these things, moving them around. And so I think for a lot of people, when they start to see this cultural movement that's breaking down what were these harder structures in European society, they see this as the beginning of the moves that lead us here. I don't think most people would look at John Locke and say, yes, of course, he's for the new atheists trying to figure out if you should trans the children or not.
Actually, I do, and I'll show you why. Locke's ideology was the first in history with liberty as its objective. By necessity, this required a philosophical justification for dismantling fixed power structures like hereditary monarchy, which was predicated on inherited superiority. Locke needed to claim that all men were equal. But there was a significant problem. Human beings aren't actually equal. To overcome this, Locke had a brilliant solution. What if the inequalities between men are almost exclusively based on environment and education? He borrowed Aristotle's concept of the blank slate, which says that human beings are born without knowledge and must learn. He then converted it to a claim about human nature. Quote, "I think I may say that of all the men we meet with, 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education." Unquote. This conversion of Aristotle's epistemological blank slate to an ontological claim meant that, from this point forward, liberals, socialists, communists, feminists, postmodernists, and others could claim human equality in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The direct consequences of the ontological blank slate manifested themselves in the violence of the French Revolution, the utopianism of New Soviet Man, the starvation of millions resulting from Lysenkoism, the destruction of ancient culture during Chairman Mao's Four Olds campaign, repeated attempts to abolish the age of consent across various Western nations, and of course, the interpretation of gender as merely a social construction. A worldview that has led to the chemical castration and mutilation of thousands, including children. And before you assume that I'm making a genealogical argument, you need to understand that the internal logic of liberation requires absolute equality to operate. Sex, race, age, body type, orientation, and other categories would lend themselves to predefined roles, the establishment of hierarchy, and the possibility of exclusion. The ontological blank slate is therefore thematically necessary to any liberationist ideology.